Is that this bill being now read a second time? I'll call the member for Hasluck.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. Deputy Speaker, I rise today to speak to the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander People's Recognition Bill 2012. This bill will have a short step, and is a short step, of a long journey that we as Australians are taking towards healing hearts and minds. This bill represents not the first or the last stop on our journey, but one along the way of recognising the important role and place that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples hold in our nation's history, current day and into our future. Deputy Speaker, in recent years our nation has made significant progress towards restoring the relationship between all Australians. Leaders on both sides of the political fence have been instrumental in achieving what we have thus far. Some 20 years ago, in December 1992, the then Prime Minister Paul Keating delivered the significant Redfern speech at the Australian launch of the International Year of World's Indigenous People. Mr Keating said, and I quote, "This is a fundamental test of our social goals and our national will, our ability to say to ourselves and the rest of the world that Australia is a first-rate social democracy, that we are what we should be, truly the land of the fair go and the better chance. Perhaps when we recognise what we have in common, we will see the things which must be done, the practical things. The message should be that there is nothing to fear or lose in the recognition of historical truth or the extension of social justice or the deepening of Australian social democracy to include Indigenous Australians. There is everything to gain." Deputy Speaker, these words are an important beginning to a healing of the process of our country, and having been there at the time, it was quite a moving event. Other leaders have also contributed to the public sphere about this issue, making lasting impressions on Australia's culture through their words of leadership. In 2008, in his national apology speech, then Prime Minister Kevin Rudd said to the Parliament, "There comes a time in the history of the nations when their peoples must become fully reconciled to their past if they are to go forward with confidence to embrace their future. Our nation, Australia, has reached such a time. Because the time has come, well and truly come, for all peoples of our great country, for all citizens of our great Commonwealth, for all Australians, those who are Indigenous and those who are not, come together to reconcile and together build a new future for our nation." In response, the Honourable Dr Brendan Nelson MP, then Leader of the Opposition, cited Neville Bonner in his response to the apology. The first Aboriginal Australian who came to this Parliament was Neville Bonner. He said in prophetic words to the Liberal Party members who selected him, "In my experience of this world, two qualities are always in greater need: human understanding and compassion." Dr Nelson said it well. These qualities are abundant in Australia, and the reconciliation process has been a manifestation of this as Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians walk together to strengthen our collective society. This bill that we are discussing today is not the final stop in our journey. This bill is instead a single point that we can look behind us and see what we have achieved, and that we have achieved much, and look ahead to see the distance yet to travel. Yet, from this point forward, there is a greater understanding that there are ways that this Parliament and the people of Australia can come together to recognise Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples of Australia. I believe the Leader of the Opposition, Tony Abbott, has picked upon a growing consensus in our nation. Mr Abbott said in his Closing the Gap speech, "There is a new spirit in this land. There is a new spirit which reaches out to embrace the Indigenous people of this country, so different from the spirit that was abroad when the Prime Minister and I were young. It is a tribute to so many people in this place and around our country that this is now the case." This bill is a small step of a long journey that we as Australians are taking towards healing. It recognises the unique and special place of the First Peoples of our nation. It is the product of a growing number of Australians who understand that our nation, to prosper in the future, that all Australians need to be brought on this journey together. This bill is the result of extensive work of an expert panel who was tasked with engaging Australian public, both Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, as well as other Australians. The expert panel was charged with determining possible options for constitutional change. Additionally, the expert panel was tasked with refining proposals for a referendum and building support necessary for successful constitutional change. The expert panel chair, affectionately known as the father of reconciliation, Patrick Dodson, said about the expert panel being convened, "We're gathered to take a remarkable step forward to a nation that acknowledges its history, its heritage in its founding document, forward to a nation who stands up to be counted as the opponents of racism and the proponents of recognition." The panel's engagement process was a thorough national consultation open to many considerations. Over the past 2 years, I've been a part of this expert panel, and we've handed down a series of recommendations that this bill now refers to. The report reflects the gamut of propositions posed by all of the people involved in the consultation process, and it was the view of the panel that out of the consultation process, we should encapsulate for the prosperity of this nation and for its history the range of propositions that were put forward by both Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and Australians, that it be captured so that the record of the day stands for the future for those who wish to reflect back upon it and take components of it to take it to the next step in the history of this nation of being as one. Specifically, the report recommended the removal of Section 25, which contemplates the possibility of state laws disqualifying people from voting at state elections on the basis of their race. The removal of Section 51(26), which can be used by the Commonwealth to enact legislation to discriminate for or against people on the basis of their race. The insertion of a new Section 51A to recognise Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and to preserve the Australian Government's ability to pass law for the benefit of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. The insertion of a new Section 116A banning racial discrimination by the Commonwealth, and the insertion of a new Section 127A recognising Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander languages were this country's first tongues, while confirming that English is Australia's national language. These suggested constitutional amendments need to be considered, and a decision needs to be made by this Parliament as to what the proposed changes are likely to gain and what broad base of support will be obtained from the Australian community for it to be successful in a referendum. As a member of the panel, and now as a member of the Joint Select Committee on Constitutional Recognition of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, we have been particularly conscious of the difficulty in securing amendments to the Constitution. Only 8 of 44 previous proposals to amend our Constitution have been successful, and it has been some 36 years since the last successful constitutional referendum. For an important issue as this, it is important that any proposals have the united support of the Parliament and that they are truly bipartisan in nature. This bill highlights the grave importance of education and awareness in the Australian community. We are conscious that there are still some in our society who are resistant to change. Until there has been a broad-reaching national awareness about the options forward, we cannot consider further actions. The Constitution must reflect the views of all Australians, and any proposed changes must be given a fair hearing through public education and awareness before a referendum is considered. But I believe our nation will be ready for such a change in our Constitution when the appropriate time comes. There is a significant bipartisan support for constitutional recognition. The Prime Minister herself in January of 2012 said, "The recognition of Indigenous people in the Constitution is another step in that journey of building trust and respect between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians, a step that is critical to our efforts to close the gap." Leader of the Opposition has also iterated his support of this issue, and in speaking of what he has observed of the attitudes held by Australians, has said, "We accept that millions of Australians' hopes and dreams are resting on constitutional recognition of Indigenous people. It is very important that we should appropriately acknowledge the place of Indigenous people at the heart of modern Australia." I commend much of the efforts that have been made thus far by groups including but not limited to You, Me and Unity. It is clear that although the consensus of the public has changed significantly since the process began, there is still some distance to go. This process will not be complete until the views of all Australians is reflected in our Constitution. This process will not be complete until the people of Australia have been given the fair opportunity to weigh up the options for constitutional change and make their personal assessment on this. This bill highlights that it is an important process that a referendum is held when there is the most chance of success. It is impossible to predict at this point in our journey exactly when this will be. But most importantly, we will need to understand that this is not a process that can be rushed. Awareness and support takes time to build. It is vital to note that this bill is not intended to act as a substitute for constitutional recognition. This bill merely foreshadows the importance of raising public awareness in order to achieve the recommendations of the expert panel. It is clear that the journey is one that as a nation we have far to go. As the You, Me and Unity campaign declares, it's time for us to recognise the first Australians. Let's write the opening chapter of our national history and story into our founding document of law. One of the challenges that we will need to contemplate as members of the Australian Parliament is our own role in influencing the awareness within our electorates and within the roles that we play and the way in which we engage with the broader community. Because if a referendum is to be successful, then it requires the 150 plus members of this Parliament to play their active role in ensuring that the discussions are balanced, that the discussions contemplate where it is that we need to take Australia in the future. That to walk together as a nation, to build Australia in the way that doesn't reflect the past, but reflects the opportunities, that engages an understanding. It is not dissimilar to the period for which we had the bicentennial celebrations. When we celebrated that, it was fascinating watching the number of people who sought to seek links back to the convicts on those early ships that came to Australia. And when they found them, they were proud to announce that they had convict heritage. Australia had matured considerably to accept that there was a convict past, but the recognition of the connectivity of family to that past was is equally important to them in the bicentennial year as it still stands today. I would hope that in the future that the connectivity to the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities of this country will become as equally important to every Australian, that they will see the relationship that they have established either by marriage or through the work that they have done together and walked together. Let us take this step, another step forward towards healing the hearts and minds of all Australians, and I commend the bill to you, Deputy Speaker.